Okay, so welcome. So today we're going to be doing a quick webinar on some orchids, particularly those that are found in Wiltshire. I'm not going to include all the species of orchids within the entirety of England, so sorry if you've come from elsewhere, but today we are mainly just going to be discussing what we find throughout this county and the importance it's going to have on the Ancient Woodland Inventory update. So for those of you who haven't met me before, hi, I'm Charlotte. I'm the Ancient Woodland Inventory Officer for Wiltshire. My screen is not allowing the gallery view or for me to put up my... No worries, Tanya, thank you for letting me know. For those of you who haven't met me before, hi, I'm Charlotte Dacre. I'm the Ancient Woodland Inventory Officer for Wiltshire. There is an AWI officer per county or parish. I just happen to be the one for Wiltshire. And the project was first launched in the 1980s to basically try to map our ancient woodlands and see how far they've come. And since then, of course, we started to digitize things. And I found a couple of gaps in the data that we think would be really beneficial to check out, such as smaller parcels or other types of woodland habitat, including things like woodland, parkland, pasture, and other potential microhabitats within that as well that were unfortunately missed either due to time constraints or limited data back in the 1980s. So for Wiltshire, ours, I believed, was published in 1984, and then we got the records in 1985, and then it was digitized back between 2009 to 2011, and the pilot project to reintroduce the AWI was launched back in 2019 and has since been ongoing. So for Wiltshire, at the moment, we're looking towards more next year, probably between May time, but we'll just have to play it by ear and see how many records and how many sites we get to survey. So that's just a little bit about the project. If you do have any questions about it, I'm happy to answer some more at the end of the session, mainly because I know that quite a few of you lovely people who have logged in today are volunteers on that project, and I know you're probably sick of hearing me talk about it. So we're just going to move on to the orchids and dive straight into it. If it's going to let me, there we go. So first up, we're just going to chat a little bit about the different types of orchids that are found within England and then kind of go into more county specific species. So depending on the botanist you speak to, there are roughly between 45 to 69 species of orchid, including hybrids. So some botanists prefer not to include them and others will include them. It just depends on who you're speaking to and the scientific literature available at the time. We are very, very fortunate here in Wiltshire in that we have the chalk downs and a lot of calcareous grasslands, as they tend to be the richest in orchid biodiversity. But it is also really important to remember that biodiversity and abundance are two completely different things. So just because we get maybe quite a diverse range of species, it doesn't mean that we have the most populated orchid county, if that makes any sense. And we are very fortunate in that we have our own flower. Specifically, we've chosen the burnt tip orchid, which is pictured just there. A lot of the images that I'm using today, I've either taken myself or are from the Wiltshire Wildlife Trust or the Woodland Trust as well. So not all of them are mine, I'm afraid, but I thought it would be really helpful for you guys to be able to get your eye in and be able to identify some of the features for yourself. So the bigger picture, the more purpley one, the kind of one that matches my top, is the common spotted orchid that I was able to identify at Great Wood last year, around about June, July time. It was absolutely gorgeous. And then just next to it, for comparison, I decided to put the burnt tip orchid, so you can see a vast difference in the coloration, and you can kind of see why it's a showstopper in itself. But if you did want to go out and find this very specific orchid for yourself, I'd recommend going to Coombe Bisset. However, you do have to time it just right because a lot of orchids do have a very short flowering period. These are some of the more noteworthy species that I wanted to talk about today, specifically for Wiltshire. So photographed here, we have the heath, we have the green-winged, also known as the green-veined, and then we also have the frog orchid. And as you can see there, some of those are threatened and vulnerable. So the species that you're likely to encounter throughout Wiltshire include the bee orchid, the common orchid, the burnt tip orchid, the green-veined orchid, the great butterfly orchid, which is absolutely stunning. If anyone has a photo or if you're able to Google at the same time, I would definitely recommend looking up the greater butterfly orchid. Its structure is so different to what we would normally think of when we think of orchids, if that makes any sense. The early purple orchid, more on that a little bit later on. Frog orchids, which are a personal favorite of mine, and fragrant orchids. However, that is not a conclusive list. There are many, many other species that you can find here in Wiltshire that we just don't have time or the capacity to be able to discuss in full details today. So I just wanted to tell you a little bit about the ones I picked today and why. So the heath spotted orchid, it's kind of similar to this photo I showed you at the beginning. If you look at the common orchid, it's a more reduced version, as I like to think of it. It's a little bit shorter in stature. However, the colors are still just as vibrant. It's just as beautiful. And it just shares a lot of those similar characteristics, which is why a lot of people get them confused. But according to Plant Life, you can actually distinguish between the heath spotted orchid and the common spotted orchid by comparing the depth of coloration within the splotches on the leaves. And also by the depth of the lowered lip. Now, that sounds very botanical, very intense, but basically you just got to look out for the difference in coloration when it comes to the leaves, and also the size of the lower lip and how deep down that actually goes. The really interesting thing about orchids specifically is that they are one of the few species that can actually hybrid. And when I say hybrid, I don't mean just produces one offspring that then becomes infertile and is unable to produce more. I mean more in the sense of that they can then continuously hybrid with one another, and that the hybrids can produce their own seeds as well. But I'm getting way ahead of myself. So let's just focus on the ones that we see in front of us right now, and we'll get into more about the anatomy a little bit later on. In the center here, funny enough, it's called the green-winged orchid, and there is a very specific reason for that, and it's not the coloration itself. So it actually gets its names from the veins that you're able to find underneath the flower hood. I did try and include a more zoomed in photo of the white variation in the center there. I hope you guys can see it okay. However, this particular plant is actually now near threatened on the vascular plant red list, which raises a lot of conservation concerns, especially here in Wiltshire. So if you are interested in finding one for yourself, the best place I would recommend going would be Parsonage Downs. So that isn't actually a reserve that we own, but it's absolutely beautiful nonetheless. It's stunning. And I always find personally, I don't know about, I can't speak on behalf of all of us, but I know that bees tend to, well, bumblebees specifically, tend to be quite a common pollinator of orchids. So usually if you follow where the bees are going, they're usually going to take you somewhere really interesting. So I especially say with the green-winged one, just because I feel like if you spot that one, it's kind of like gold dust. It's an absolutely beautiful specimen that I'm still yet to actually see myself. Oh, okay, great. That's an absolutely incredible point. Thank you, Jerry. So Jerry just mentioned you can also find the green-winged on Lower Moor Farm, which is actually one of the sites I was going to talk about a little bit later on. And then finally, I did want to just very quickly discuss the frog orchid, because unfortunately it is vulnerable. I've been a bit cheeky in putting the vulnerable sign by the red list. That's not actually correct. It's vulnerable according to the Plant Atlas in 2020. And it's actually been described as potentially the UK's fastest declining orchid, which is really, really upsetting, as I'm sure many of you feel the same. But the reason, or one of the reasons, why we believe this plant might be declining significantly is actually due to their coloration and their size. They're quite small in stature, in comparison to some of the more flashier mauve, purpley, pink colors we associate with orchids. They're more of a dark burnt red color, but not burnt in the same, like the burnt tip where it's a gradient. They just look kind of like the end of summer plants when they're kind of wasting away, if that makes any sense. But if you did want to find one, Wiltshire is one of the hotspots where you can find quite a few, because they prefer downlands and quarries, so any sites that have potentially more disturbed ground. But their main preference when it comes to soil is chalk and limestone, which we have quite a lot here in the chalk and cheese landscape of Wiltshire, which is really exciting. The main thing, as I mentioned earlier, that because of their coloration and their stature, they're often missed. So I can't speak on behalf of this particular population itself. I haven't looked into it in enough detail, but it would be really interesting to find out if this orchid is being missed and that's what's contributing to the vulnerable status, or if it is also in decline on top of that. I didn't have enough time to be able to look into that in further detail, but it would be a really good opportunity to be able to compare those two things to see, you know, is it actually on the vulnerable list in Wiltshire and then within England, or is it just one of those flowers that because it's not absolutely, you know, show stopping, pulling out all the bells and whistles, not drawing everyone's attention, that it gets missed. So it's really interesting to try and look into the different reasoning behind why some plants are in decline in comparison to others. But if you did want to look up a little bit more about it, they do have the BSBI red list, and they do have, it's incredibly comprehensive actually, and it includes quite a few different vulnerable and endangered plant species that can be found here in Wiltshire, which can be a bit disheartening to read, but it's also quite eye-opening as well. So some of those common flowers you walk across or walk past every day that you think is just everywhere might actually be more vulnerable than you think. So now going back to what we were discussing earlier about the orchid ecology and adaptations. So for those of you who don't know, this is what a bee orchid looks like. The reason I included this very specific photo is because I believe it actually might be a hybrid. It isn't one of my own, but it does appear to me to have the anatomy slightly off center, which gives me the idea that it could potentially be a hybrid. But to talk a little bit about orchids themselves and overall aspect, they are some of our most oldest flowers. They are the largest floral family currently known to science, with a very recent study actually published in February this year, associating them to be around the same time as the dinosaurs. I'm using air quotes there because when we say dinosaurs, that could mean, I mean, they were around for a very, very long time when it comes to, you know, looking at historical evidence. So I don't know when about, because it was a private paper, so I don't know when about they meant specifically, but it is really interesting if you think of those artistic interpretations of dinosaurs just suddenly have an orchid in them, which I found really, really interesting. I'm just going to check the chat for 2 seconds. Bee orchids are by Oddstock Hospital and Pewsey Downs. Wow, incredible. And green wings, for those of you who are also interested, are also found in Salisbury Plain. I should have just asked you guys where to find them all. Incredible. I now have so many new sites that I need to go and investigate this summer. So they're also habitat specialists. So as many of you may know, if you've seen orchids for themselves or done any research on them, or maybe you own a more decorative specimen within your house, you know that they have very specialized and intricate relationships with fungi, and a lot of them actually have very specific germination requirements that if the pollen comes into contact in the exact correct way, or the weathers are skewed slightly, or the soil conditions are wrong, or the climate changes too quickly, it can actually reduce the chances of offspring, which is really interesting. So they are very, very specific when it comes to their individual needs. Excuse me. They are also incredibly diverse. So as you've probably already seen from some of the other images that we just talked about earlier on, some of the other specimens, they each have their own kind of vegetative style. And there is a really, really good resource that I'm going to discuss later actually that goes into more depth about that when it comes to identification. But they also have their own pollination methods. So here, for example, let's use the bee orchid. As its name suggests, it's trying to mimic a female bee. It's trying to get the attention of a bee to get that pollen in order to be able to continue the succession, which is really, really interesting to me. So usually when it comes to orchids, soil tends to be the main determining factor, or that's currently what is known to science anyway when it comes to their distribution, with the rarest species being found on chalk downs. So we're very, very fortunate here in Wiltshire that we actually have those types of habitats that we can then go and investigate and look further into. But more recently, researchers with the Natural History Museum piloted a project also called Orchid Observers. I would definitely check them out if you don't if you haven't already, because they do have a wealth of resources themselves. But they were able to study the effects of climate change on the distribution of wild orchids after a study previously had only looked into investigating climate change in orchids as a whole. They wanted to see how it would impact wild orchids specifically, which is now, as you can probably imagine, is becoming much more of a topic of conversation and concern, especially within the ecology and conservation sector. So it's going to be really interesting to see kind of the outcomes of those types of studies in the future and where that leads us next. Sorry, do we have any questions for the moment? I'm just going to check the chat. Sutton Lane Meadows near Chippenham is a very good site for green-winged orchids as well. If anybody knows where to find the greater butterfly orchid, do let me know. So this is actually, I don't know if my camera is going to pick up on it very well, but, oh, it does not. If I put it in front of me, there we go. So this is absolutely gold dust. It's one of my favorite books. I've only discovered it within the last couple of weeks, and it is jam-packed with information. And it's actually the book that's on the screen. So it is The Wild Orchids of Britain by V.S. Summerhayes, who actually happened to be, for a very long time, where is it? He worked at Kew Gardens, which is really interesting to me. So Victor Summerhayes from 1898 until 1974, was the leading orchid taxonomist of his generation and curator of the Orchid Herbarium at the Royal Botanical Gardens, Kew, from 1925 until his retirement in 1964. So he specifically specialized in tropical orchids, but if it wasn't for his ongoing research, we wouldn't be able to have literature like this that has been absolutely fundamental to our understanding of orchids in general. I'm just going to check the chat one more time. There is a lesser butterfly orchid near Pewsey, and you believe you might have seen greater butterflies there too. Interesting. Okay. Thank you, Wayne and Lenka. I'll have to look into that after the session. So I do have a better photo of this a little bit later on with the name, because I understand that you can't really see it too well at the moment, mainly because the background of my setting is actually great wood, as that's where I found the common orchid and I thought it would all tie in together. But that's obviously put me at a disadvantage on showing resources. So hybridization and genetic complications. More common than you would think. So artificial hybrids, and when I say artificial hybrids, I mean in terms of selective breeding. So those are the ones you would find at garden centres. Those are the ones that would attend shows and things like that. They tend to be bred for specific characteristics or traits. Now, as I mentioned earlier, because orchids are quite well adapted when it comes to hybridizing, it does mean that you are then able to create more orchids out of the original hybridized orchids, if that makes any sense. So their lineage doesn't just stop once an orchid is produced as a hybrid, because usually when we look at the animal kingdom, oftentimes a hybrid will become infertile. They won't be able to continue that lineage, but that same kind of pattern has not been seen within orchids. It is important to remember as well that the orchid family is huge. It's one of the largest families we know currently to botany. And with that in mind, there are obviously going to be individual groups within that do not necessarily hybridize very well. So of course you can understand, as the humans we are, we have gone along and tried to produce the best show-stopping, most beautiful hybrids possible through selective breeding. So orchids, as I mentioned, they naturally hybridize and they can produce viable offspring, but they have been found that usually, kind of like if you were to breed two types of the same fish, they're more likely to breed together because they share similar traits. The same thing is kind of like orchids. I say that as someone that has no knowledge of fish, so that's a really bad example, but I'm sure you can appreciate where I'm coming from. So it's more about if they look very similar in their characteristics or their genetic makeup, they're more likely to be more suitable for hybridizing. But that doesn't mean that two individuals that look nothing alike can't hybridize, because it has been done. It definitely has been done. So hybridization can also occur, yeah, as I mentioned, so between genre, and also within genre as well. So between genres, also known as bigeneric hybrids. It's a lot of scientific terminology to just say two completely different orchids are bred together. But I thought that'd be really interesting for you guys to know. And I've included here actually a page from the book that specifically looks into the lip structures and how they differentiate between different species. And as you can see, there is a wide, vast variety there. There's a lot going on. It's absolutely fascinating. I think they're fantastic. So I did find out as well that hybrids in the Orchis family, which is home to the early purple orchid, are more common. But that, as I mentioned earlier, doesn't necessarily mean that it's more likely to occur just because they're from the same genre. It can also happen between genre as well. My favorite part, the early purple orchid. So the reason that I wanted to discuss the early purple orchid today is because it's common. It's one of the first flowers you're likely to see during spring, especially in woodland situations. And they are also an ancient woodland indicator species on the AWI update, which is obviously what I'm currently working on at the moment. So the early purple orchid kind of looks very similar to this. The splotches, it produces kind of a rosette shape. The only thing that I've noticed, and of course this again comes down to, you know, is it genuinely also a hybrid or is it an early purple orchid, is sometimes the spotting coloration is more purple and more violet, and then other times it's a little bit darker in coloration. So it has been really, really interesting. But of course, for this specific presentation, of course, I could only find one photo of early purple orchids in my archives. Anyway, so some of the really interesting things about them is they are native, they're widespread, you can find them all across the country. I did read that they're not too familiar with the central of England and Ireland, believe it or not. So kind of like north and southbound. There are a lot of them in Wiltshire. This time of year, actually, from now until June would be the best time to go and see them whilst they're in flower. A lot of my surveying has taken part before June. So I've usually seen quite a few of them more in the rosette stage, as you see there. I want to do a little bit closer, a more zoomed in image for you, so you can see it's kind of got this little sheath sticking out, and they usually about 5 or 6 just produce little rosettes. They can be very, very close together as well in distribution, which is really interesting. But again, they're just really common. You can find them usually on like disturbed sites. I haven't seen too many on road verges or like roadsides and anything like that. I haven't found them too much in open sources as well, which apparently you can find them a lot in open grasslands. I've mainly found them on the edges of ancient woodlands or within ancient woodlands, but when it comes to canopy, they seem to be rather indifferent. So if you have seen any, please do let me know. I'd love to investigate that further. And also feel free to send us any photos you have. The other really cool thing about them is that they can produce up to 50 flowers per head, and they are more of a dark mauve kind of color rather than the classic pinky purpley association that we usually associate with orchids. But yeah, so that is part of our AWI update for those of you interested. Now, I know that we've been discussing it a little bit already in the chat, but these are some of the best sites that I found in Wiltshire anyway when it comes to being able to identify orchids and when to identify them as well. 1 moment, sorry. Here at the Wiltshire and Swindon Biological Record Centre, we are kindly hosted by Wiltshire Wildlife Trust. So we are able to get access to quite a few of these sites, which is absolutely fantastic. But of course, this is not a comprehensive list of all the sites where you're likely to see orchids, especially because, for example, the common spotted orchid can be found in gardens. So, of course, I haven't just started noting down people's addresses on where they live. That would be a bit too far, a bit too into orchids. But these are some of the sites where I've come across or I've heard talk about, or people have shown me photos of when they've come across them, which I found really interested. And we do actually have a site called Where to See Orchids on the Wildlife Trust site. The only thing with that is it's not exclusive to Wiltshire. And some of the sites that I've noted down were not on that particular list. So I drank my water too fast, I'm so sorry. So it is worth, investigating your local patch just to see what you can find. But on average, it's thought that orchids tend to bloom earlier when they're on south-facing slopes, and they're more likely to be found on south-facing slopes as well. But species that are found more in like bogs and fens, which we don't happen to have too many of those around here, they tend to bloom a little bit later in the season. So when it comes to timing, it's really important to look into them on a species level, because of course each species usually has a very restricted time zone on where they will or will not bloom. A lot of them within like a month to 2 month period. But also it is important to remember the type of habitat you're looking at as well. If it's a more densely packed woodland and they're not usually found there, it might take them a little longer to open up. If it's a grassland and it's on a south slope facing kind of verge and it gets sun and the weather's good in England, fingers crossed, they might leave quicker. If it's been a more milder winter, they might be likely to bloom earlier. For example, I was able to identify some early purple orchid rosettes. So going back to the photo I showed you guys earlier, this one, I was able to identify quite a few of those in the middle of February. Now, I know that these can start to bloom by the end of February, as very, very early, and they'll come into flower about April time. So it's really important to take that into mind or consideration when you're going out to investigate different sites on where to find orchids. But some of my favorites of this list specifically is Coombe Bisset Down, and also Morgan's Hill. I feel like Morgan's Hill Nature Reserve is completely underrated. I have found some of the best fungi there. I have found some of the best orchids there. I have found some of the most insane wildflowers there. It's absolutely beautiful. So if you are able to go down there, I definitely recommend it. And also any sites that are relatively local to Cown, believe it or not, are actually quite more populated or hotspots for orchids, so shall we say. I'm just going to check the chat. I posted in earlier. Interesting. I'll have to take a look at that, Madeline. Thank you so much. Going to move on to some recommended resources. Oh, apparently not. We're just skipping ahead. I clicked play a little bit too quickly there. We're going to move on to some recommended resources. So I'm sure many of you by now have heard about the Orchid Hunter by Leaf. I think it's Leif actually. My apologies. He's a young botanist. I actually had the book myself, but I haven't began reading it yet. It's on my to be read list, but I've heard nothing but good things. So if you do have an opportunity to check that one out, do let me know, because I haven't had the time yet to be able to sit down and have a read of it. But some of the ones that I have, utilized today for my research and also that I've just found genuinely really interesting is the Wild Orchids of Britain by B.S. Summerhays, at the Wiltshire and Swindon Biological Record Centre. You are welcome to ask if you can see some of our books as well. We have an extensive library, so if there is something that you're interested in looking at, but you're not sure if you want to buy it for yourself and you just want to take a peek to see if it's worth it, we likely have it. So do just send me an email. I'll be more than happy to go forward with that. Probably the best one for beginners, I would say, would be the PDF guide produced by the Field Study Council. That's the one that's been photographed. It's incredibly comprehensive for such a thin laminated sheet. I don't actually have mine with me. I left it at the office. But it's incredibly helpful. All of their guides are incredibly useful. A lot of people, when they want to think about orchids, they usually associate orchids with having spotted leaves, but that isn't always the case, and this guide just absolutely proves it. I definitely check it out if you haven't already. The one second to last about the vegetative guides to orchids, That's the one that I was mentioning earlier that goes into a little bit more about the style of the leaves and how they're formed and how the tiny, tiny intricate parts make up each species. And I thought it was absolutely fascinating. It's incredibly comprehensive and it's written by a botanist that actually specializes in orchids. So if you would like to check that out, I'm happy to pop a link in the chat for you as well. And then the identification guide by the Orchid Observers. So that was the citizen science put together project from back in 2016, but a lot of the data they produced, especially the identification guide actually, would still be relevant today and is definitely worth looking into further. So those are my, my top 6 resources when it comes to looking into orchids. But I also found some really incredible blogs along the way that were incredibly interesting to read, where people are actually tracking different orchids they're finding over a 10-year period, or have been looking at just orchids specifically in their local patch rather than the entire county. So there are a lot of people out there that this is a really, really hot topic of conversation. A lot of people do want to discuss orchids. So it's worth looking into some different blogs around Wiltshire as well. But when it comes to very specific guides or looking more into it from a beginner standpoint, these are definitely the resources I would recommend, other than the top one, just because I haven't personally read it yet. But as I said earlier, I've heard nothing but good things, so fingers crossed. If anybody is interested, oh, I have a chat. I'm so sorry. Britain's Orchids by Sean Cole, sorry, and Mike Waller is a great guidebook. Lots of high quality photos, from rosettes to flowers, habitats, etc. Thank you so much, Lenka. That's incredible. I'll definitely keep that in the chat for anybody that's interested. Quite a few of you have put in different places that you can find specific orchid species and other resources. So if you haven't checked out the chat already, I highly recommend just giving it a quick glance over before the session ends. In the future, going forward, as part of the AWI, we will be putting on some other webinars as well, some other workshops. The GPS workshop is specifically for AWI volunteers, for surveyors on the project. So people who are going out to find the early purple orchids. However, it is open to everyone. The only difference being that is if you're a volunteer on the project, you do get access to it for free. Where there is obviously going to be a fee if you're just coming in from an outsider's perspective, alongside the ecology training date that is to be that is going to commence a little bit later in the season. So please do hold tight, and I do thank you for your patience. The other two more overview topics that we're going to be putting webinars on for will be the chalk grasslands and wildflowers, and maybe a couple more towards the end of the season. We'll see how we go. But yeah, do feel free to ask if you wanted to see future webinars and workshops, the little catalogue page. And we also do have some others on the Nurturing Nature project run by Cranbourne Chase. So if you're interested in learning more about that, I would definitely check out their website. It's currently being run by a gentleman called Michael New. I share a lovely offered space with him. He's fantastic. He's doing quite a lot of webinars and workshops and things like that, more directed at nature as a whole rather than more of an overview, if that makes any sense. But thank you so much. So managed to do it in enough time. I have left 20 minutes at the end of the session for anybody that has any questions or would like to discuss anything further. I really appreciate your patience and thank you once again for joining me this evening. As mentioned, it is more of a whistle-stop tour rather than a complete overview of orchids as a whole. There are many, many species that I missed and many, many that I would like to have included. But I was trying to be more realistic with the time that I gave myself. So there is a donation link there if anybody is interested in donating to Wiltshire Wildlife Trust, who happen to host us. I'm very grateful for them. And I've also included the QR code, but I'm now going to stop the recording. So if you'd like to speak, please wait until the recording has completely commenced.